The Prince and Princess of Wales have finally broken their silence, and their first words to the public have landed like a thunderclap. Camilla had been certain, absolutely certain, that William and Catherine would never find the nerve to do what they just did. Only 5 minutes ago, her exit from Windsor Lodge was officially confirmed. The locks now answer to the palace once more. Her personal staff have been let go, and the very keys she had waved around as proof of her lasting grip on the place have been quietly stripped from her hands. Yet none of that is the truly explosive part of the story. What forced William and Catherine to decide she could no longer stay under that roof was something far heavier. For weeks, Camilla had moved through Windsor Lodge as though her name were already carved into the deeds. She signed off on lavish renovations, pushed out staff who had served the family for years, tightened the guest list until close relatives were being turned away, and even paraded the property in front of visitors as if Charles had personally handed it to her forever. In the beginning, no one dared push back. That silence was the very oxygen keeping her plan alive. Then Catherine spotted the one thing Camilla never imagined anyone would catch. Several personal belongings that had once been kept in storage, items tied to Queen Elizabeth and to Princess Diana, had quietly disappeared. They hadn't been misplaced. Under directives traced back to Camilla's office, they had been wrapped, labeled, tagged, and carted off into storage. William had never signed off on it. Catherine had never been told, and the family only learned the truth when one shaken member of staff finally broke ranks and whispered what was happening. That single revelation changed the entire battlefield. What had looked like harmless redecorating suddenly resembled something far more calculated, an effort to erase the lodge's original identity and stamp Camilla's authority onto every wall. Portraits had been shifted, guest rooms had been rearranged, family plans were being canceled without warning. And whenever staff dared to question the instructions, they were bluntly reminded that the Queen was now in charge of the house. Catherine didn't lose her temper. She did something far more dangerous. She asked for the paperwork. Slowly, storage lists began arriving. Renovation orders, access rules, staffing changes, and then the formal objections filed by household managers, warnings that certain items could not be moved without family consent. According to one such notice, that exact warning had been delivered straight to Camilla's office. The move went ahead anyway. That is the moment William stepped fully into the picture. He learned that one sealed crate contained a Diana-related item, an object he had personally believed was shielded from being touched without his knowledge. From that instant, this stopped being a quarrel about furniture or floor plans. It became a test of the limits of Camilla's power, of palace protocol itself, and of the family's right to guard its own memory. He wanted one answer above all others. Who had signed the final order? The trail didn't stop at some junior assistant. It ran straight through Camilla's private office, sliding past 2 separate objections, before ending at a chain of directives that treated Windsor Lodge as her personal territory. And what unsettled everyone even more was the discovery that royal funds had quietly bankrolled changes that had never been properly cleared. That single finding pushed Camilla into a corner no amount of formality or prestige could talk her out of. Hello, viewers. Do you feel it's the right thing that William and Catherine have finally stood their ground against Camilla? If you're on their side, drop a yes in the comments. And honestly, if you love William and Catherine but keep watching without ever subscribing, you're only helping the people who want stories like this buried. If you believe Camilla should never have been allowed to treat Windsor Lodge as her personal estate, hit subscribe, tap the like button, and share this video with someone who needs to see it. Even so, Catherine still tried to keep the dispute behind closed doors. In a private note, she asked Camilla to freeze the renovations while the family reviewed everything, to bring back the items that had been removed, and to lift the fresh restrictions on access. Camilla's response arrived cold as ice. She informed Catherine that Windsor Lodge was now hers to run, and that Catherine ought to worry about her own household instead. What Camilla didn't grasp was just how much damage that single reply had done. Catherine had approached her quietly, precisely to spare Charles the embarrassment, and to keep the family from splintering in public. Instead of stepping back even an inch, Camilla dug in harder. Within days, fresh instructions began circulating that described the lodge as Camilla's permanent residence. Another family visit was canceled. More staff were shuffled aside. But permanence, in the royal world, demands proof. Palace officials expected to unearth a formal grant, a lease amendment, or a written instruction signed by Charles himself. When William demanded to see the original occupation documents, none of that existed. What surfaced instead was a conditional arrangement, one hinging on the continued consent of the family and the proper use of the property. And buried within it was a line Camilla's office had apparently glossed over. The agreement could be revoked if royal staff, resources, or property were misused. By nightfall, William and Catherine were no longer wondering whether Camilla had crossed the line. They were preparing to prove it. Every warning, every invoice, every storage list, every canceled access notice, Catherine gathered it all into a single dossier. William ordered a full inspection. Meanwhile, palace officials had already begun quietly examining the very clause that could rip the residence away from her, all while Camilla continued strutting through the lodge as though no force on earth could remove her from it. Catherine's first instinct had never been revenge. It had been containment. She understood how easily a private disagreement inside those walls could spiral into a public spectacle, and she knew Charles would be the first person crushed in the middle the moment Camilla felt cornered. So a message was sent, requesting a quiet conversation, away from staff, away from cameras, away from the whispers already drifting down Windsor's corridors. The meeting was brief. Catherine began by raising the missing items. She explained that several belongings tied to Queen Elizabeth and Princess Diana had been shifted without permission, and that staffing changes were beginning to eat away at family access. All she asked was that the removals be paused until William and household administration could untangle what had happened. There were no accusations. There were no threats. Camilla didn't budge. She answered with the calm certainty of a woman who believed the argument was already settled. According to those aware of the exchange, she made it plain that Windsor Lodge was now under her authority. She was choosing the staff. She was overseeing the renovations. As far as Camilla was concerned, Catherine should keep her focus on her own household and stop poking her nose into affairs that no longer touched her. The temperature of the room shifted with that single sentence. Catherine had walked in trying to avoid a public scene. Camilla read her restraint as weakness. There was no apology for the items removed, no concern for the family members being cut off, no suggestion that the changes might be reviewed. Instead, Catherine walked out with something dressed as a dismissal, but functioning as a warning. Step back, or you'll only embarrass yourself further. Catherine did not step back. Over the days that followed, the restrictions became sharper. A family visit that had been on the calendar for weeks was suddenly canceled. 2 long-serving staff members were quietly told their roles were under review. Camilla's private guests were placed inside a guest suite that had, until then, always been reserved for family gatherings. New aides began checking names at the door, even when those names belonged to relatives who had walked in and out of the lodge freely for years. The message could not be clearer. Camilla was tightening her grip before anyone else could challenge it. The atmosphere inside, according to one staff member, was tense and watchful. Open conversations between staff dried up. Verbal instructions were reinforced through private notes that never reached the ordinary administrative channels, and workers grew afraid of losing their positions. Some quietly complied. Others began discreetly making copies. Catherine did exactly the same. Every canceled appointment was logged. Every reshuffle in staffing was dated. Every access request was written alongside the reply it had received. She collected security notes, storage inventories, renovation memos, and the names of every person assigned to carry out each change. What had started as a family quarrel was steadily transforming into a case file. Then, a former lodge employee delivered the piece of information that pulled William directly into the storm. The renovations weren't being paid for solely out of Camilla's private office. Invoices revealed that royal household resources had been drawn upon for alterations that had never received full approval. Payments had been slipped under maintenance codes broad enough to escape immediate attention. New furniture appeared listed under required replacements. Decorative work had been buried inside structural upkeep. Staff assigned to official duties were being pulled aside to help manage Camilla's personal arrangements. This had stopped being a matter of taste. It had become a matter of authority. When William was finally shown the paperwork, he didn't erupt in the way Camilla might have braced for. He went silent. He read every page. He asked who had authorized the storage of Diana-related items, Who had reassigned the staff? Who had signed off on the payments? Each answer pointed back to Camilla's office. Then William demanded the original Windsor Lodge regulations. Not a summary, not an aide's paraphrase, the actual documents. He wanted the funding conditions, the occupancy terms, the ownership record, and every amendment attached to it. Palace officials began searching. Inside Camilla's inner circle, the initial assumption was that the review would confirm everything she had been telling people, that Charles had granted her sweeping authority, that her position was untouchable, that William might grumble but wouldn't dare openly challenge the king. Then, tucked deep inside the residence file, an archivist found a line. The wording made no mention of permanent ownership. Camilla had not been granted an unconditional lease. What existed was a family arrangement, dependent on continued approval and on the proper use of the property. Beneath that, another sentence, a separate clause. Decoration was not what it addressed. It spoke of misuse, of unapproved spending, of restricted access, of family property being treated as personal property, and it granted the household the power to revoke occupancy. It seemed no one in Camilla's office had ever bothered to read it. Once William found that clause, he didn't confront her immediately. He waited. He waited until staffing orders, funding records, and directives about storing family belongings had all been lined up against the residence file. He didn't want any room left for confusion, for gaps, for a simple denial. By the time the meeting was scheduled, he had seen more than enough. Camilla arrived believing the conversation would be about protocol. William made it clear at once it was about conduct. One by one, he laid the papers in front of her. The canceled appointments, the reassigned staff, the renovation invoices, the access restrictions, the storage instruction connected to Diana's belongings. And then he asked the question she had been dodging. On what authority? Camilla did not answer with a document. She answered with a status. She said Charles had raised no complaints about the changes. The household understood her position. The residence had been placed at her disposal. That, in her view, was enough. The king's consent, she believed, did not need to be logged every time she moved a chair or swapped a staff member. William disagreed. He reminded her that Windsor Lodge was not a personal trophy. Inside it lived protected items, official expenditure, family history, and agreements binding several households together. Verbal understandings could not erase written conditions, and moving anything belonging to his mother without informing him was not something he would let pass. At that point, Camilla changed her strategy. She warned that pushing the matter further would embarrass Charles. Any public quarrel over the lodge would make the king appear incapable of managing his own household. It would spark headlines, deepen tensions, and raise loud questions about who was really in command at Windsor. The warning was carefully chosen. William understood it. Back down and the family avoids a scandal. Press on and he'd be blamed for causing one. He pressed on. William ordered that every decision made since Camilla had begun using the lodge as her own home be reviewed. Officials were told to examine occupancy, security, staffing, spending, maintenance, guest access, and the removal of belongings. Nothing would be accepted on reputation alone. Every claim required proof. Catherine sat at the heart of that review. She had preserved the written objections filed by household administrators. Several had warned that long-serving staff could not be dismissed without consultation. Others had challenged the use of maintenance accounts for personal alterations. One had asked Camilla's office to delay moving family items until their status could be confirmed. The reply had been terse. Proceed as instructed. That single line stripped away every remaining excuse. Camilla's office had been told the limits. It had chosen to walk straight past them. And more records surfaced after that. A security notice listed names attached to William's household on a restricted access list. A staffing memo showed rooms previously kept for family visits placed under the sole authority of Camilla's aides. An invoice included work carried out before approval had ever been given. Piece by piece, the pattern became impossible to explain away. This was not a single bad decision. This was a system. The sharpest testimony came from an administrator who had sat inside an earlier planning meeting. Camilla, they said, had spoken about the lodge as though everything were already carved in stone. She had spoken about revised staffing levels, new guest arrangements, and rooms that would no longer be available for shared family use. When asked whether permanent authority had been secured, one aide had replied that no one would dare question the Queen. That belief was the foundation the entire plan had been built upon, and William's review was about to pull that foundation apart. Hello, viewers. If you believe William and Catherine will defend the legacy of Diana and Queen Elizabeth, then show it. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a yes in the comment section. The only people who benefit from silent viewers who refuse to support them are those who think their conduct should never be questioned. Share this story with someone who might stand with William and Catherine. By the time the review closed, officials had reached a conclusion Camilla had never braced for. Her hold on Windsor Lodge was not protected by ownership, not by a long-term lease, not by any unlimited royal gift. She had been allowed to live there for as long as she respected the home's family purpose and used it appropriately. And the very same agreements handed the household the power to intervene the moment those terms were broken. William asked for one final confirmation. He needed to be sure the clause could be enforced without Camilla's consent and without Charles being forced to sign a new order. The reply arrived that evening. It could. But that answer opened another discovery. Camilla had been warned 3 separate times before the review even began. According to Catherine's file, each warning had spelled out that her authority came with conditions. Each had pleaded with her to reconsider. Each had been ignored. Inside the palace, the question was no longer whether Camilla had misread the arrangement. It was how to deal with someone who had been warned, who had understood the risk, and who had marched forward anyway. William's sordid file had grown into more than a list of complaints. It had become a roadmap of how Camilla had steadily consolidated her power, one decision at a time, while everyone around her assumed someone else had approved it. Catherine laid the pieces out in order. First came the room plans, then the staffing schedules, then the storage records, then the security instructions, the maintenance account invoices, and the correspondence that showed exactly how objections had been handled, not answered, overruled, ignored. One image caught William instantly. A sitting room, photographed before it all began. The same room, photographed only days later, several family pieces gone. New furniture already in place. A fresh portrait mounted above the mantel. The space no longer looked shared. It looked claimed. And that was exactly the point. The alterations followed a clear blueprint, not a scattered impulse. Camilla's private guests were placed at the front of every priority list. Her aides controlled access. Staff loyal to the previous household drifted out of key positions. Items connected to earlier generations quietly vanished from view. With every change, the lodge began to resemble not a family home, but an extension of her personal court. That was the moment Catherine understood something crucial. When Camilla had told her to focus on her own house, it wasn't a burst of frustration, it was a glimpse of a plan already in motion. William and Catherine were not simply being asked to tolerate new decor. They were being pushed out of a residence Camilla intended to command entirely. The most damaging proof came from a long-serving staff member who had held their silence until then. That employee had been present when the earliest storage instructions were drawn up and had watched the older staff members grow uneasy. No one wanted to lose a job they had held for decades. No one wanted to defy a queen. But one instruction had struck them as too serious to let slip past unnoticed. So they kept a copy. It was signed. The document ordered the removal of several protected items and instructed staff to finish the transfer before the next scheduled family visit. The timing was the giveaway. Those pieces hadn't been moved for urgent restoration. They had been moved before William and Catherine could witness what was happening. Then Catherine uncovered the warning attached to it. 2 days before, an alert had been sent stating that no transfer should take place until ownership and family access were verified, and that the listed items required consultation. And still, the removal order followed. Camilla's office had known. That discovery destroyed the last plausible defense, that this had all somehow been a misunderstanding. The directive had been issued after the risk had been explained in writing. Nothing had slipped through an overworked office. The mood among the review team shifted. Officials who had been careful began speaking more openly. The lodge had been handled like private property. Royal resources had been used to smooth the transition. Family access had been walled off. Written restrictions had been in place. Yet Camilla's representatives made one last stand. They argued that Charles had verbally agreed to it all. That claim dragged the review into its most delicate stage. Officials searched for anything that could support it: a royal warrant, a signed letter, a lease amendment, a note from the king's private secretary, even a diary entry confirming that permanent authority had ever been discussed. There was nothing. Charles might well have given Camilla permission to make use of the lodge. That was not the same as granting ownership. He might have known she wanted alterations. That was not evidence he had approved restricting family access, spending household funds, or removing protected property. Words spoken in private could not overwrite conditions agreed to in writing. Then William asked whether the occupancy could be ended without triggering a full constitutional storm. The lawyers returned to the clause and traced every action inside Catherine's file against it. Their conclusion was blunt. The terms had been repeatedly violated. The household had every right to end the arrangement. William and Catherine approved the next move. A formal notice was drafted. It listed the breaches, ordered every piece of unauthorized work to stop, returned control to household administration, and required Camilla's personal staff to leave the property. A final line was included. A deadline was set for the surrender of the keys. Inside Windsor Lodge, Camilla's reaction to receiving the notice was swift. Doors were pulled shut, phone calls went out, staff were told to hold their tongues. One aide insisted the ruling would be reversed by dawn. But morning came, nothing changed. As Camilla's office scrambled to find anyone willing to halt the deadline, palace staff were already assembling inventories, access orders, and a full security plan for the handover. For the first time, the question was no longer whether she would go. It was how she would react when she did. The car that rolled past the gates on the morning of the deadline was not Camilla's. It carried the inventory team overseeing the transfer, 2 household officials, and a security supervisor. No photographers waited outside. No prepared statement had been drafted. The palace wanted the handover completed quietly before rumors ran out of control. Inside the lodge, Camilla's aides were already in motion. Personal files disappeared from desks. Garment cases were being carried down the main staircase. Framed photographs wrapped in cloth were stacked beside labeled boxes. One assistant moved rapidly between rooms, checking cabinets and drawers against a confidential list. Another stood at the front door, demanding to know who had cleared officials to enter before Camilla had even finished her call to Charles. The answer sat in the notice. By the deadline, household administration would have full control again. Once the final handover was complete, no member of Camilla's private staff could stay behind. No room could be sealed off from inspection. No item could leave without being examined. The officials did not argue. They read the terms and began. That composure only made everything worse. Camilla had expected resistance she could inflate into outrage. If she had raised her voice, she could have claimed she was being humiliated. A public row would have painted William as reckless. Instead, every movement was measured. Every box was recorded. Every doorway was opened under written authorization. The process left her nothing dramatic to fight against. Then came the first dispute. Camilla's personal belongings included a set of silver frames, but the inventory listed them under the lodge collection. Her assistant said they had been gifts. Officials asked for records. None were produced. The frames stayed. Then 2 paintings, a writing desk, and a cabinet containing letters from an earlier royal generation. Each time, the same rule applied. Personal property could go, family property could not. The boundary Camilla had disregarded was being drawn again, room by room. William and Catherine were nowhere to be seen. That was intentional. Their absence meant Camilla had no way to turn the handover into a private confrontation. But their authority sat inside every document on the table. Catherine's records had built the pattern. William's review had triggered the clause. And the officials carrying out the decision had no intention of turning back. By late morning, Camilla finally stepped down into the entrance hall. At first, her tone was calm. She asked about the timing. She requested to see the senior official. She said the residence could not be surrendered while conversations with the king were still ongoing. The official's answer was flat. No family conversation would suspend the notice. The deadline had passed. Occupancy was over. That was the moment the restraint snapped. Camilla accused Catherine of engineering the humiliation from the very beginning. She said the questions over staff and storage had been inventions designed to strip her of her authority and cast her as a stranger under this roof. Then she turned her fury on William. She said he was twisting Diana's memory to punish anyone who dared to challenge him. The room went still. William's answer was already written into the handover instructions. The removal was not about personal history. It followed a documented pattern of breaches concerning protected family property, staffing, spending, and access. An accusation could not undo the record. Camilla rejected that explanation. She insisted that one private sitting room remain locked until Charles gave a ruling on it. Her assistant produced a separate key and refused to place it with the others. For a few minutes, everything halted. The security supervisor examined the notice. The senior official produced the full occupancy schedule. Every room inside the lodge was listed. There was no retained suite, no private exception, no lingering right of access beyond the termination. The final line of defense collapsed. Camilla was told that keeping the key back would be treated the same as denying the handover. There was no threat in the official's voice. He simply stated what would happen next. The room would be opened, its contents would be recorded, and a note would be entered that the key had not been surrendered willingly. The assistant turned toward Camilla. She gave a small nod. They set the key on the table. By late afternoon, the personal cars were ready. Under the eyes of inspectors, who checked every package against the inventory, Camilla's staff filed out slowly. The last of the boxes were loaded. The entrance hall stood empty. One car paused at the gates before turning onto the road that led away from Windsor. Inside, the silence returned. But the palace still had a choice to make. Advisors pushed for no public confirmation. They believed the family might allow the story to fade if the departure could be framed as an ordinary shift. William and Catherine wouldn't agree. Too many people already knew. Too many records existed. Silence would only leave space for another version to be written. They decided to speak that night, and what they were willing to confirm would make Camilla's departure impossible to bury. William and Catherine chose their words carefully, but the meaning was severe. Camilla was no longer at Windsor Lodge. The residence was no longer being run by her private team. The unauthorized work had halted. The keys were back where they belonged. Household administration had reclaimed every room, every account, every access point. The confirmation moved fast. Aides across palace offices knew what the public did not yet grasp. This departure had not been chosen. It was the result of a review that had exposed just how far Camilla had walked while assuming no one would ever question her. She had treated the residence as permanent. The paperwork said otherwise. William did not celebrate. He ordered the restoration to begin. As storage records were reopened, staff identified every item removed during Camilla's time in the lodge. They compared old room layouts, inventories, and photographs. Ordinary furniture was set aside from anything tied to Queen Elizabeth. Anything linked to Diana was checked directly against William's own records before being returned. Out of all the boxes, one remained sealed longer than the others. Inside sat the private item that had drawn William into the fight in the first place. Its label indicated it had been scheduled to be transferred elsewhere, but the wrapping was still untouched. Had the staff member never spoken up, the object might have vanished into a larger royal collection, far from the lodge, unnoticed by anyone who understood its story. Catherine watched the restoration without turning it into a victory parade. For her, this had never been about pushing another woman out. It had always been about drawing a line. Confidence could not be used to claim shared property. A room could not be scrubbed clean of family memory just because those memories made someone uncomfortable. Authority had limits, even when the person testing them wore a crown. The lesson was written down. Long-serving staff who had been forced out were quietly contacted. Some were offered their old positions back. Others were needed to help rebuild the internal structure of the household. Neutral authority over guest arrangements returned. The power to decide which family members could enter the lodge was pulled out of the hands of private aides. The victory came with weight, but the lodge was no longer an extension of Camilla's office. Charles was suddenly facing questions he could not brush aside. How much had he actually known? Had Camilla used his name assuming no one would dare ask him directly? Or had he genuinely signed off on the renovations? Did he understand that royal funds had been feeding private alterations? And above all, did he realize that items connected to his late mother and to Diana had been removed after written warnings had been ignored? No answer came. The stillness sheltered the king, but it did not shelter the trust around him. William had learned something permanent. Family promises meant nothing without paper. Catherine had learned her own version of it. Private diplomacy could be mistaken for weakness, and Camilla had learned the hardest lesson of all. Status could delay consequences, but once the evidence was gathered, no signed condition could be wiped away. The internal balance of Windsor shifted. Staff became cautious about acting on verbal instructions alone. Administrators demanded written approvals for decisions once passed through casual conversation. Security teams re-examined who held the power to restrict access to shared residences. Every household received the message. William and Catherine would challenge anyone who treated royal tradition as personal property. In that sense, Camilla's departure grew far beyond a single lodge. It marked the moment her authority stopped stretching wherever she wanted it to. She had believed every decision would be shielded by Charles's status. She had assumed staff would stay silent, that William would keep out of it, that Catherine would remain polite. Every one of those assumptions collapsed, and the fall was of her own making. If Camilla had stepped back after the first warning, the disagreement could have ended peacefully. If she had reopened family access, reviewed the spending, or returned the items, William might never have ordered the investigation. Instead, every refusal added another page to Catherine's file. Every attempt to tighten her grip produced another witness. By the time the notice arrived, the case against her had been built entirely by her own choices. Hello, viewers. Please leave a comment saying yes if you're glad William and Catherine refused to let Camilla walk over them. Now subscribe, like, and share this video. Those who support William and Catherine yet keep watching without subscribing are quietly denying them the public backing their strongest choices deserve. By dusk, the restored rooms had already been inspected. The lodge fell quiet again, but not out of fear. It was the sort of silence that settles after a battle, when everyone realizes the rules have shifted. William and Catherine had not merely evicted Camilla from Windsor Lodge. They had shown her that leaning on Charles's name would no longer be enough, and that the next clash could be even sharper. The next film turns toward a private payment file uncovered inside the renovation accounts, one that holds an invoice approved just 2 days after Camilla received her final warning. If the name attached to that payment is revealed, the palace would not be able to contain what comes after. It could show whether she had ever truly acted alone.